Happy Hour, the podcast that explores new and exciting historical fiction novels. I'm your host, Jane Healey, and in today's episode, we welcome British author Emily Critchley to discuss her novel, The Undoing of Violet Claybourne, which publishes weekly, called an artful, Gothic-tinged mystery and an immersive, chilling treat for suspense fans. And I totally agree. It released March 4th. Welcome, Emily. Thanks for coming on.
Hello. No, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So I'm going to do a quick bio about you, intro, and then and we'll dive in. So Emily Critchley's YA debut, Notes on My Family, was nominated for the Carnegie, longlisted for the Brantford Bowes, and Book of the Week for the Sunday Times. Her debut novel for adults, One Puzzling Afternoon, was featured in People Magazine's Best Books for Fall 2023 and Women's World Book Club, and it received a starred review from Booklist, among other accolades. Emily Critchley has an MA in creative writing from Birkbeck University of London and currently lives in, how do I pronounce this? Hertfordshire? I guess
Hertfordshire, yeah.
Hertfordshire in the UK, where she works as a librarian. Again, welcome and thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you.
So I got to hold up the book because it's a beautiful cover too. Undoing of Violet Claybourne. Your publishers described this novel as historical suspense with chilling Gothic undertones and a hint of the speculative, which I think is a perfect description. I read that you started writing this novel during the pandemic. Talk about the premise of the story and how you came about writing it.
Oh, sure. Okay. So I think there were a number of inspirations for this book. I mean, definitely it has quite a claustrophobic feel, which I think a lot of us were feeling during the pandemic. But I think it came slightly from my love of kind of country house novels and books about the English class system at that time, sort of upstairs, downstairs books. I really love interwar fiction, anything set either in the wars or around the First and Second World War. To me, it feels like history that's kind of, at the end of our fingertips, like it's not that far away, only a few generations. I have grandmothers that lost brothers in the wars, and it always just that period has always fascinated me. And then I think another inspiration is that I've always loved sister novels, whether they're historical or contemporary. I'm one of three sisters, and anything about sisters, I just always want to read and lap up. And I think my initial inspiration for the book, I had finished my previous book, One Puzzling Afternoon. I wasn't sure what to write next, and I just had this reoccurring image that kept coming back to me, and it was of this sort of Gothic crumbling mansion and three girls in pale dresses standing at the front of it. And I had no idea what this image was, but it just kept coming back to me. And I thought, oh, this is going to be my next book, and I don't know what it is. And but this is the one that I'm going to have to write next.
Oh, fascinating. I wish I had images like that come to me for my books. That never happens for me, but that's amazing. So this is told from the perspective of not one of the three sisters, but of Gilly. Is it pronounced Gilly or Gilly? Gilly.
Yes, Gilly. Yeah.
Gilly, it starts in 1999. It goes back to her days at boarding school in 1938, and she meets this kind of quirky roommate Violet who moves in with her, Violet Claybourne at boarding school. Was it always going to be told from Jill, like an outsider perspective of the three sisters' lives?
Yes, I think so. I had Gillian's voice like quite early on. And I think I just wanted that outsider's perspective. I wanted somebody to arrive at this house and look at this family who kind of wasn't a part of that world, who was slightly different. So really, Gillian and Violet, they meet at boarding school and they are from two quite different class backgrounds. Gillian she was born in Egypt and her father sent her to boarding school in the UK. And she's very lonely at boarding school. She doesn't know anybody, she doesn't have a lot of friends. And then she meets Violet, and Violet is, she's a daughter of the landed gentry. Her father is a lord, and she's very, very much from the upper classes. And Gillian kind of becomes fascinated with Violet herself, and also these kind of stories that she hears about her family. And when Violet invites Gillian to spend the kind of Christmas winter break at her house, Thornleigh, Gillian is really excited and she can't wait to go.
Yes, and so that kind of sets the story in motion. So one thing that all the characters are very well developed, and I want to talk more about that. But Gilly noticed very early on that Violet is different, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say that she has like OCD traits and definitely what would be described as neurodivergent today. And what was the inspiration for Violet as a character? and another thing that I was when I was reading it too, I think that it's not easy to, well, first of all, write about people in a different time period, but then teenagers is a
Mm.
challenge. So what was the inspiration, and what was it like to write about Violet and Gillian and their friendship?
I think I knew initially that Violet was going to be a little bit different. And I think that's what Gilly actually quite likes about her, first of all. And I didn't quite know during my first draft what sort of condition Violet would have. It really came out in the writing. I think it became clear that she probably, yeah, is somewhat neurodiverse. But the OCD didn't really happen until my second draft. And Violet calls her OCD her undoings. So she has these kind of various thought patterns that she can't break. She has rituals and compulsions, which is common with somebody with OCD, but she also has there's so much going on in Violet's mind. She like builds up all these things throughout the day that she's done wrong, and then she kind of has to go through them all and undo them, and that takes a long time. And as anyone with OCD will know, it can be a really, really draining condition to have. So Violet's, yeah, her conditions, they kind of I felt that they got more and more present with each draft, really. And then I felt that I really did need to set those up quite early, knowing what was going to happen to her later on in the novel.
Hmm. Definitely. As I said, all the characters are really well drawn. Violet's sisters, Emmeline and Laura. Gilly gets to meet them when she goes home for holiday. She's kind of enamored with them. They seem very glamorous, upper class. And what is your character development process like for all the main characters? Do you sketch them out ahead of time? Do they kind of just evolve as you write drafts? Like what's your process? Like, I'm always curious.
I think a little bit of both. I think with this book, I had some index cards, like one for each sister, and I started to just make some notes about personality traits and kind of the differences between them, because they're three sisters from the same family, but they are all quite different. So yeah, I don't know if I've ever done that before in a book, but I did for these sisters, as I really wanted them to have these kind of different traits. But definitely, when I'm writing a first draft, my characters are sort of like acquaintances that I'm, still getting to know. And then with every draft that goes on, I get to know them better and better and better. And you can just really kind of deepen those existing traits that they have.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I want to read this. I read an article, and your book was included, and I thought this was such an interesting quote. For many Gothic writers, the setting is more than just a backdrop, it's a character. As Hugo Award winner Arcady Martin puts it, Gothic is a romance between a girl and an evil house. Talk about, which I love that quote, and I loved the setting. And did you consider Thornleigh Hall, where the Claybournes lived? Did you consider that as like almost another character in the story? Because it was so atmospheric and dark and moody. And
Oh, absolutely. I knew very early on that, well, ever since that image came into my head, really, that the book was going to have sort of Gothic vibes and a few Gothic traits. And, I love writers like thinking of books like Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier and Shirley Jackson's We Have All Lived in the Castle, books that another sister's novel with a creepy house. And I'm very inspired by what I read. And I was thinking a lot about those two writers. And yes, I really wanted the house to kind of strike Gilly as soon as she arrives. There's that scene where she's been driven up the front path, through the gates, and she sees a kind of crumbling Gothic Thornleigh Hall. And the Claibornes, they're kind of running out of money at this point in the story, and they can't afford to do repairs to it. And there's a section of the house that's sort of eerily burnt, and I really wanted to make that image very, very strong, before she even steps inside the house.
yeah, no, it was excellent. Was it based on any estate in particular, or was it totally from your imagination?
It wasn't based on any in particular, but I did of course Google several. There was one in Somerset that I quite liked the look of, but I now can't remember the name of. But I had various kind of images that I put together on a sort of mood board before I came up with Thornley.
Very fun. Um, here's another quote that is from the article from you. When I think of Gothic, I think it's kind of a claustrophobia. And you mentioned that during the pandemic, we all felt like we were in claustrophobic conditions. But like when you describe like your definition of Gothic, I mean, it's certainly this novel falls under that for sure. But I think that people have different ideas of what it means to write to be a Gothic novel.
I think along with the claustrophobia, to me, it's about secrets, things in the past that we don't yet know of. It's about, I feel like there's often a character who feels at odds with the rest of the world, with the rest of their environment, and that's very much Violet. She is very, very different. And yeah, I don't know. I think just the whole atmosphere. This was a book that really started from atmosphere for me, which is why I think it ended up being so gothic. I saw that image, and it was a book that the setting and even the weather, it happens over winter, all that played such a key part in the book. And that's never really happened for me before, that atmosphere has been so, so important.
Yeah, and you captured it so well. The majority of the story takes place when, interwar years. And so what was your research like for that era? I mean, had you been, I mean, I'm sure like we all have kind of a base level of knowledge of what it was like then, but did you have to go deep into some of the research at the time? I mean, I thought it was one of the things that was interesting. There was some elements of Downton Abbey for me in
Hmm.
this, and these families that were aristocratic and so wealthy and living these lives that were just coming up against a new era that and their lives no longer meshed with that. Like you said, these estates were running out of money and getting run down. So what was your research like for that?
Yeah, really fun. I think it was something that always had fascinated me. And, it's a thing that a lot of us do, at the weekend, we'll go and visit a big country house and walk around, and they're all owned now by sort of English Heritage or the National Trust. And ever since I was a child and my parents would take me to these places, I loved, looking in the ballroom and then down in the servants' quarters, and yes, I did enjoy watching Downton Abbey when it first aired. I think we all loved Downton Abbey. So I think, and then it was really nice just to be able to go that little bit deeper and to really start to think about their way of life and how it was just really diminishing. And this started around the time sort of after the First World War, and writing this interwar novel, most of it is set in 1938, and there was a lot of anxiety, of course, in 1938 in England about the possibility of war. So it's already quite an anxious time. But also, I really wanted to try and capture the kind of the reverberations of the First World War. And what happened in England is that so many men and boys, really, they were, most of them were barely 20, were killed, and this meant that a lot of these houses, a lot of these families no longer had male heirs. And this was the case with Lord Claybourne. So Lord Claybourne is the sister's father. And he was the third born son and would never really have inherited Thornleigh if it wasn't for the war and that his two brothers were killed. And he is scarred kind of mentally and physically by the war. And I think that's what interests me about the interwar period is you've got these big changes happening and this kind of dismantling of a class system that had been in place for centuries and centuries. And then all of a sudden in the 20th century, the war comes along, so many men are killed, women go to work to help with the war effort for really the first time, and the upper classes are making do without their servants because they're all in the war effort. And things never really went back to the way they were, we talk about sort of like the last golden summer of 1913 and just after the Edwardian era, before everything changed and things never really went back to the way they were before. And around the kind of very early 20th century, I read that the biggest kind of employer in the UK at that time would have been these country estates. So you would have been working in service, and that just seems incredible. That I don't think of it as that long ago that the biggest source of employment in the UK was to be working in one of these country estates. Certainly by 50s, 60s, 70s, they were being destroyed, and the upper classes, the kind of the Claibornes of this world, were almost becoming a kind of figure of comedy. Like that's just not the way that we live anymore, and that's so antiquated and out of date. And I think that short and quite sharp decline from after the First World War up until the kind of 60s, when these houses were being turned into schools or being demolished to make way for retail parks and supermarkets and housing estates, and it was so swift that happened really. And I do think it's a great thing that this kind of revolution of the 1950s happened in the UK, and that working class culture was given such a boost, and that's all fantastic. But we did lose a lot of beautiful stately homes
Mhm.
that were demolished. And I don't think anybody really sat and thought, gosh, these homes were created by incredibly, famous architects, and they're absolutely beautiful and they're part of our heritage. And we managed to save a few, but many and many were destroyed, and that I found really interesting actually researching that.
Yeah, really interesting. Because I know that there's ones that you can visit now, but I can't imagine how many were destroyed because of progress. And now you look back and you're like, yeah, those were historic, should have been preserved, maybe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to talk about packaging for a second because I love the cover and when I first saw the title, I was like, oh, it's going to be told from Violet's perspective, The Undoing of Violet Claybourne. Was the title always going to be The Undoing of Violet Claybourne, even though it's not told from her perspective?
No, no. So I didn't really have a title. My working title was probably just the Claiborne Sisters. That was probably what my Word document was called. And then because I have a UK team and a US team, we went backwards and forwards about titles, and both teams came up with various titles. And actually, we couldn't agree for a while on what the title was going to be. And I really wanted the same title across both territories, as I just find it's easier. People are looking on Goodreads, or it's I don't want anybody to be buying the same book twice. So I really said I wanted the same title, and then I came up with a title, which was it was my suggestion. I had about 5 titles, but this one was my favorite. And
Hmm.
and the UK said yes, we really like this, and then the US jumped in and said yes, we think we really like it too. Um, and yeah, I did kind of think, I suppose, that it's not, yeah, it is Violet's story, but it's told by Gillian. But
Hmm.
I don't think that mattered. And the response I've got from readers has really been, oh, poor Violet, and but her story's so interesting. And so
Yes.
I think it's right. I think it's right. I'm really pleased with it. And I love the cover. Absolutely love the colours on the US cover that we're looking at now. It's just so beautiful. And I was so pleased when it came through.
So beautiful, and I think it fits with the title and the undoing of Violet Claiborne. It makes you ask questions. Titles are so hard, and
Mm,
I think
they
it
are.
works. So, did you have a say in the cover design? Because I know that's like a tricky thing with publishers.
So with the US, no, they sent me the cover, but I loved it. So I was so glad that I hadn't had a say, that I hadn't put through any ideas that might have influenced them, because I really, really enjoyed it. And with the UK cover, I saw some kind of early drafts, and they were worked from early drafts. But the US cover arrived just to me, just pretty much how it is. And I said, yes, yes, yes,
Oh,
yes, I
great.
love it.
That's rare. I think that's amazing. Yeah, they did a beautiful job.
Mm.
And I actually, as I was reading it, I'm like looking at like the different symbols and the flowers and different things that even made more sense. Um, so I want to talk about like your writing life and your writing career. This novel is a departure from both like your last novel for adults and your young adult novels. It's a really different genre. And why did you decide to pivot to this?
I think when I was writing One Puzzling Afternoon, that was a novel that is set, but it has a dual timeline. So it's set in the present day, which at that time was 2018, and then it's also set in the early 1950s. And I really, really enjoyed the historical element, the writing the 1950s part, even though it's probably harder. I loved doing the research, and I loved finding that voice and capturing that era. So I was quite keen to do something historical again, or a dual timeline. And I thought this might be a dual timeline, and then it seemed to just work better. So the book is sort of bookended, if you like, by Gillian in the 90s. So we're with her first in the first chapter, and then we're with her in the final chapter as an older lady looking back. So I wanted to do something historical, and I had sort of a few different ideas, but again, that image just kept coming back to me. And then I got that first line. So there's now a chapter before this, but the first line that I had was, Gillian going to meeting Violet Claybourne. Violet Claybourne was my roommate, and that's why we became friends. And I just had that first line. And I thought I really, really like that first line. That's really strong. So I just kind of went with that. I felt like I had her voice, and I really need to have a character's voice when I start writing.
Definitely. And was there anything about this genre, like diving into this, that was particularly challenging to you?
Yes, yeah. Lots of it was challenging. It was challenging. I did get stuck about halfway. So well, not really halfway, about 40% through the book. There's a big event that happens. I think it says on the blurb, there's a sort of an accident in the woods that changes the course of Gillian's life and all the girls' life. And I got to that point, and then I got a bit stuck afterwards about where to go next. And I ended up writing a little bit from Frank's perspective. So Frank is the kind of guy that lives in the cottage on the grounds. And I wrote a little bit from his perspective. perspective and some other characters' perspectives. And in the end, I decided that I didn't need any of that, that I just wanted to stick with Gillian as my narrator for the entire novel. But I think at that point, I just needed to find a way through after that big shocking event. I needed to find that. But I know I really enjoyed the being in the historical time frame, and I think just keeping the suspense up was really important to me. There are always lots of different challenging elements, but I think I did have a bit of a wobble about 40% through. I thought, oh gosh, this big event has happened, and where to go next.
I feel like I feel like 40% is where like a lot of writers have a wobble. I feel like I always have a
Mm,
wobble around that part. You're like, oh God, am I doing this right? Like, is this
yes.
going to come out on the other side and be okay? Yeah, yeah. I think
Mm.
that's common. And actually, this segues into my next question really well. So, these are questions that I always ask writers. What is your process? Do you plot things out? Do you write by the seat of your pants? Is it kind of in between? How do you write?
I think I'm probably more of a pantser. I tend to write about a one-page synopsis that will just have the very basic plot points on it. And that helps me, but it's really also for my agent so that she knows what I'm doing next. You know, agents and editors, you know, they like to know what you're doing. So I really do that for them. I don't know whether I would even do it. I might just keep it in my head. I think I'm trying to get better at plotting. I think it is really helpful. But I just enjoyed the exploration so much. You know, I think doing a first draft, it's so difficult, but it's also the most exhilarating part of the writing process, where it's terrifying, but it's also when it's going right, it's amazing, and I really enjoy that process. But not to say that I would like to get slightly better at plotting, and every book is its own beast, you know, it demands something different. And if the next book came to me and said it needed to be very tightly plotted and it had a lot of plot and that's just what it needed, I just tend to go with whatever the book wants, really.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Um, how do you strike a balance between fact and fiction in your storytelling, particularly when it comes to like historical facts? Are there any strict rules that you adhere to?
No, not really. I mean, I suppose I was lucky in that this novel wasn't based on any person who actually lived in real life. They're all fictional characters, and my setting is also fictional. But I wanted to just remain true, I suppose, to key events in history that were happening around the time. So I knew that I was setting it in 1938, and I wanted to capture the sense of anxiety. And then there is a small section of the book where we do go into the early years of the war, and that was quite important to me that you know that timeline was correct. And that was really interesting as well, actually researching London, because Gillian has a short time living in London. And even though it's only a couple of chapters, researching what it was like in London during World War II was really, really eye-opening and quite horrific, really. Poor people being bombed, you know, every night.
Yeah.
And getting up the next day and going to work and picking themselves up. And I read a memoir about somebody who was working in London during that time, and she, you know, about half the people that she knows in the book have been killed, unfortunately, in the bombings. It was just really, really horrific, but really interesting. Yeah.
Every time I read or research about that time in London, I'm always like astonished. Like, how did they do it? Like, how did they
Mm.
just, like you said, wake up every day and try to go to work when like there's a house bombed out right next to their own house? And it just unbelievable, crazy.
Yes, yeah, you got people sleeping down in the, you know, the tube or the subway that you would call it, you know, down and
Yes,
you know, and then
wild.
it's just, yeah, just really, really mind blowing. I'm definitely open to setting something during World War II in London, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Um, what advice do you have for writers? You've been doing this a while now about writing and about getting published. Those, I know those are two very different things, but what advice would you have?
They are. I think about writing, I would say you've got to finish something. So I think once you finish, whether it's your novel, your screenplay, your play, your poetry collection, whatever you want to do, I think you have to finish something. And I think then you can call yourself a writer, and you can call yourself a querying writer, or a writer who's written a collection of short stories, or whatever it is that, you know, you start off doing. And then I think with publishing, I think you have to understand that not every first novel is published and that it might take you two or three. And I think if you bear that in mind from the beginning, you really have to know that you're in it for the long game. There's an agency in London, quite a famous literary agency. And I remember some years ago, they did a kind of survey about their authors and how long it took from the point when they decided, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to be published, this is what I really, really want to do, to the point where they got published. And it was about 10 years, I think. And it can happen much more
That's me.
quickly.
Yeah.
It takes,
Yeah.
it can happen more quickly. It can happen with your first book. But I think you have to be prepared to maybe write two or three and to know that you're in it for the long game and that it's, you could call it a hobby, but it's a hobby you're taking seriously because you hope eventually one day to be a published author. And you have to, yeah, try to make time for that, which is incredibly hard.
Incredibly hard. And I think that is one thing I always talk to with writers who are just starting out. It's like you have to give yourself permission to, even though you're not getting paid for it at the time, you don't know if you'll ever
Mm.
get paid for it. Like you have to give yourself permission to work, to do that kind to write and to make mistakes and write crappy drafts and all of
Yeah,
those things that get you to the next level. I totally agree.
you
Um,
do. It's
yeah.
hard.
It is hard. So you're a librarian as well, is that right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
yeah.
how does being a librarian help you as an author? Um,
Well, I'm actually a secondary school librarian, so like a high
oh,
school librarian. So I work with teenagers all day. Um, I think the best thing about my job is that it sort of gets me out of the house and into the real world. I think that if I didn't do it, I'm only part-time there, but I think if I didn't do it, I would just go a little bit crazy sitting at my desk. And it's nice to go into the real world and to talk to teenagers and young people and to try and inspire them. So I run a creative writing club and
nice.
I always tell them that I started exactly the same as you, just writing stories in my notepad, using the library, reading lots and lots of books. And I just try my best to inspire them because they're our next generation of writers and readers, really.
Absolutely. Now, have any of them read this novel yet?
A
Any of them?
few of them have, a few of them
Nice.
have. Yeah, yeah, they think it's dark. Yeah, they say, oh,
It
miss,
is
it's really
dark.
dark.
It's dark and twisty. And I'm
Yes.
sure like working with teenagers must have helped you write teenagers, even though it's a different era. That must have been a little helpful.
Yes, yeah. It reminds you that teenagers can be amazing, but also, I mean, not the ones that I work with now because they're mostly lovely, but I did think back to my own teenage years and teenage girls, as anyone will know if you've been to high school, it can be quite cruel. And these girls, they're quite cruel to each other.
Oh, yes. Have you always wanted to be a writer?
Yes, yes, I think so. I think, usual thing when I was a child, I was always making up plays and I was the one that would rope everyone into the games and then decide that I wanted to write them down. And then when I was at secondary school, I had an English teacher who she did a creative writing assignment and I submitted mine. And then she said to the whole class, I want to read one out because this is a really good piece of work and this person could maybe be a writer one day. And I was pretty average at everything in school. I wasn't particularly good at anything. And it was my piece of work and she read it
Uh,
out and she said, you can do this, you can really do this. So she was fantastic. So, and I did sort of had this epiphany moment around that time of yeah, what else could I do? This is I'm not really good at much else. So I really always wanted to do it. And then maybe I lost my way a little bit in my late teens, early 20s, and then I started to come back to it. And I thought, yeah, no, I really, really want to do this. And I started off and I took a course. And just yeah, decided that I was going to be in it for the long haul. And my first two books were not published.
I think a lot of authors have like at least one. I have like one and a half that will never see the
Mm,
light of day.
yeah,
So, yeah.
it's very common.
And thank God for teachers like that. Isn't that the best? Like,
Yes.
yeah, you never forget those teachers. Are you ready to share what you're working on now?
Oh, well, no, I can tell you that I am working on something. I have started something new, but no, but I haven't even told either my UK or my US editor what I'm doing. So probably not. My agent knows what I'm doing. I've had to send her my really ragged one page, very rough synopsis, which she has miraculously agreed that it's okay for me to work on that. But no, so I'm going to be quite secretive about it. I think I'll just say that I really enjoyed the suspense element, writing that element in The Undoing of Violet Claybourne and some of the twists. And it's definitely going to have elements of a thriller, some suspense and twists and things like that. That's what I'm hoping for.
Oh, exciting. And I won't ask anymore because I know like when it's early days with an idea, I find like you just have to keep it under wraps or it can like ruin the mojo, you know?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so I
You talk
understand
too
that.
much, then you feel like
Yeah,
you've written it already.
exactly. And it's no fun anymore. So, how I know you're on Instagram and Facebook. What's the best way that readers can stay in touch with you?
So probably Instagram, which is just emily.critchley, or my website, which is emilycritchley.com. Probably most frequently on those.
Excellent. Well, this is lovely, Emily. I'm so glad we could finally do it. And yeah, that's a wrap. I'm glad that readers can stay in touch. I'm going to hold up this beautiful cover again. The Undoing of Violet Claybourne. I think it's a great book club book. There's lots of juicy stuff to talk about, so I definitely recommend it for book clubs. And best of luck. I know the reviews
Thank
online
you.
are excellent, and you're getting a lot of buzz. So I wish you the best with it, and I hope it just soars.
Oh, thank you so much, Jane. This has been wonderful.
So lovely. So thank you. And a reminder to subscribe to my YouTube channel and follow the podcast so you can get regular updates. My latest Cold War novel releases this summer. August 1st is the new pub date, The Women of Arlington Hall, and it's available for pre-order. Next up is Share a Moon next Thursday, March 21st. If you're listening to this, you can register online because that will be live at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you again, Emily. Have a great day and best of luck with everything.
Thank you, Jane. Thank
Have a
you.
great day. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
And